But the truth is, it began to crumble the moment a vow was betrayed. It did not happen with a grand gesture or a public declaration, but in the quiet spaces between spoken promises, where the weight of a lifetime's work was held together by nothing more than the word of a man and the faith of a woman. In the city of Washington, where the marble is cold and the history is written in the ink of compromise, Eleanor Vance had become a fixture as permanent as the monuments themselves. She was a woman who understood the architecture of power, not as a seeker of the spotlight, but as the one who ensured the lights never flickered. As a senior senator and eventually the most trusted advisor to the administration, her reputation was built on a foundation of ironclad loyalty and a sense of duty that felt almost archaic in the modern age. She belonged to a generation that believed a career was a sacrifice made at the altar of the Republic, and she had sacrificed much. Julian Thorne was the man who stood at the center of her world, the president whose rise she had orchestrated with the precision of a master clockmaker. Their relationship was a curious thing to those who watched from the outside. It was not a marriage of romance, though they had been wed for 30 years. It was something far more formidable. It was a partnership of the mind and the will, a covenant born in the smoke-filled rooms of early campaigns and tempered in the fires of national crises. They were the original order, a duo that functioned with a single pulse. Eleanor provided the moral gravity and the strategic depth, while Julian provided the charm and the soaring oratory that captured the American heart. To look at them across a state dinner or a private briefing was to see the embodiment of stability. Julian would lean in, listen to Eleanor's whispered counsel, and the world felt anchored. She was his North Star, the keeper of his conscience and the architect of his legacy. In the upper echelons of power, it was understood that to cross Julian was a mistake, but to lose Eleanor's respect was a tragedy. She held the keys to the kingdom not because she sat in the Oval Office, but because she had built the man who did. There was a certain beauty in the austerity of their bond. They moved the halls of the West Wing like two ghosts of an older, more dignified era. They spoke a language of shared glances and half-finished sentences. There was no need for the loud, performative displays of affection that younger couples favored. Theirs was a love of shared burdens, of late-night strategy sessions over lukewarm coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of a bill passed or a conflict averted. They were the guardians of a specific vision for the country, a vision rooted in the idea that honor was the only currency that truly mattered in the end. Eleanor often sat in her office late into the autumn evenings, watching the leaves fall across the ellipse. She felt the weight of her years, the lines around her eyes earned through decades of navigating the treacherous currents of partisan warfare. But she felt no regret. She believed that Julian was her greatest achievement. She had smoothed his rough edges, tempered his impulsivity, and guided him toward a greatness he might not have found on his own. She saw him not just as her husband, but as the vessel for the ideals they both cherished. Their alliance was supposed to be the one constant in a world of shifting loyalties. It was the bedrock. Julian had promised her, in the early days when they had nothing but a shared dream in a small apartment in Virginia, that they would reach the summit together and that they would leave the world better than they found it. He had looked her in the eye and sworn that his power would always be her power, and that his word was a bond that could never be broken. The original order was a masterpiece of political and personal synchronicity. It was a fortress built on the premise that two people, unified by a singular purpose and an unbreakable code of honor, could withstand any storm. Eleanor Vance rested her entire life, her entire identity, on that premise. She had cleared the path for him, stepped into the shadows so he could shine, and acted as a shield against 1,000 enemies. She did not do this out of a subservient heart, but out of a conviction that their union was the highest form of service. But the seasons change in Washington with a cruel inevitability. The air turns sharp, the trees are stripped bare, and the warmth of summer becomes a distant, fading memory. As Julian entered the third year of his presidency, the halls of power began to feel different to Eleanor. The echoes seemed louder. The smiles of the young staffers seemed a bit more forced, and the silence of the residents at night grew heavier. She did not know yet that the foundation was cracking. She did not know that the man she had crafted, the man who held the highest office in the land because of her steady hand, was beginning to see her not as his partner, but as a relic of a past he was ready to outgrow. The tragedy of the original order was not that it failed, but that it was betrayed by the very person it was designed to protect. Eleanor Vance stood at the window, her reflection ghost-like against the glass, unaware that the long, slow descent was about to begin. She still believed in the vow. She still believed in the order. And in that belief lay the seeds of sorrow that would eventually reshape the landscape of her life and the very seat of power she had spent her life defending. The erosion of a grand structure never begins with collapse. It begins with the wind and the rain, with microscopic fissures in stone that go unnoticed by the casual observer. In the high-stakes world of the executive branch, betrayal does not arrive with a trumpet blast. It creeps in on soft soles, to the quiet rescheduling of a meeting or the subtle redirection of a glance. For Eleanor Vance, the first signs were so faint they felt like figments of a tired mind, ghosts of a long career that she tried to dismiss as the natural weariness of her station. It began with the architecture of their mornings. For years, the first hour of the day belonged to them. Before the chief of staff arrived, before the briefing books were opened, they would sit with their coffee and map out the trajectory of the day. It was in these moments that the real governing happened. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, those hours began to shrink. Julian would arrive late, his mind seemingly already occupied by a conversation he had held elsewhere. Or he would be on a secure line, turning his back toward her, his voice a low murmur that did not invite participation. Eleanor observed these shifts with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent 40 years reading the temperature of a room. She noticed the way the younger staffers, the ambitious men and women in their 30s who viewed the world as a series of data points and viral moments, began to treat her with a new kind of deference. It was a polite, clinical respect, the kind one offers to a museum piece. They would smile and nod when she spoke, but their eyes would immediately drift to Julian, seeking his approval to move past her suggestions. She saw it in the drafting of the midterm agenda. For the first time in their joint history, sections of the policy papers were being written in offices she hadn't visited, by advisors she hadn't vetted. When she questioned Julian about it, he would offer a dismissive wave of his hand, his smile bright but hollow. He told her she was working too hard, that he wanted to spare her the drudgery of the technical details so she could focus on the big picture. It was a classic maneuver, the kind she herself had used to sideline rivals in the past, and the irony of it was a bitter pill to swallow. There were other, more intimate signals. In public, Julian remained a devoted partner, his hand resting on the small of her back as they navigated the receiving lines of state dinners. But the touch had lost its language. It was no longer a signal of solidarity. It was a prop, a piece of stagecraft maintained for the cameras. When the doors of private residence closed, the silence between them was no longer the comfortable quiet of two souls in sync. It was a heavy, guarded silence, filled with the things they were no longer saying. Eleanor found herself walking the long corridors of the White House at night, listening to the hum of the building. She felt a growing sense of displacement, as if the very walls she had helped him claim were beginning to reject her presence. She began to notice a recurring name in the president's daily diary. A younger cabinet secretary, a man whose ambition was as loud as his suits, someone who represented everything Eleanor found distasteful about the new political landscape. Julian was spending more and more time behind closed doors with this man, discussing, modernizing the message. The betrayal was not yet an act of malice. It felt more like an act of convenience. Julian was being seduced by the idea that he could stand alone, that the scaffolding Eleanor had built for him was now an unnecessary weight. He was beginning to believe his own myth, the myth that he was the sole architect of his success. He looked at Eleanor and saw the past, a reminder of the compromises and the hard truths he wanted to forget. He wanted a legacy that was entirely his own, untethered from the woman who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, because she was the one who had buried them. One afternoon, Eleanor walked into a strategy session for the upcoming economic summit, a meeting she had chaired for the last 2 years. As she entered the room, the conversation died instantly. The air was thick with the scent of unsaid things. Julian was at the head of the table, flanked by the new guard. He didn't look up immediately. When he finally did, his expression was one of mild surprise, as if her presence was an unexpected intrusion. "Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth and presidential. "We were just finishing up. I didn't think you'd be joining us today. I thought you were meeting with the Oversight Committee." "The committee meeting was moved to tomorrow, Julian," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the cold dread pooling in her chest. As you know, he let out a small, self-deprecating laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Of course. My mistake. Well, we've covered the essentials. No need to bore you with the minutiae. She looked around the table. The younger advisors looked away, studying their tablets or their notes. In that moment, the truth was as clear as the light reflecting off the Potomac. She was being curated. She was being managed. The man who had sworn that his power would always be her power was systematically cutting the threads that bound them together. She stood there for a moment, the silence stretching long and uncomfortable. She could have forced the issue. She could have pulled rank and demanded to be briefed. But Eleanor Vance was a woman of dignity, and she knew that a confrontation in front of subordinates was a sign of weakness. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that acknowledged the shift in the room, without yielding to it. I see, she said quietly. Then I'll leave you to your minutiae. As she walked back to her own office, the sound of her heels on the marble floor seemed to echo with finality she wasn't ready to accept. The signs were no longer subtle. The original order was being dismantled, brick by brick, by the very hand that had helped build it. She sat at her desk, the late afternoon sun casting long, skeletal shadows across her papers. She was a woman who had spent her life planning for every contingency, yet she found herself staring into a void she hadn't prepared for. The betrayal had begun, and though it was still quiet, she knew the storm was coming. She just didn't realize how cold it would be. In the life of a public servant, there is a certain comfort in the tangible. Paper, ink, the weight of a leather-bound briefing book. These are things that do not lie. They are the artifacts of a life lived in the service of a grand design. Eleanor Vance had always preferred the physical record over the digital whisper. She trusted the archives. She trusted the memos. She believed that while men might forget their promises, the written word remained as a silent witness to the truth. The confirmation did not come through a leaked headline or a whispered tip from a disgruntled aide. It came during a quiet evening in the president's private study, a room Eleanor had decorated herself, choosing the heavy mahogany desk and the deep green curtains that filtered the light of the setting sun. Julian was at a fundraising dinner in New York, a rare night when Eleanor had chosen to stay behind, citing a lingering cold that was, in truth, merely a need for solitude. She had gone into the study to retrieve a file on the upcoming judicial appointments, a task that had once been hers alone to manage. As she moved toward the safe, she noticed a single manila folder resting on the blotter, partially tucked under a heavy crystal paperweight. It was unmarked, save for a small, handwritten notation in the corner, Project Phoenix. The name meant nothing to her, which in itself was an alarm. In their 30 years of partnership, there had been no projects, no initiatives, no secret agendas that did not bear her fingerprints. She hesitated, the silence of the room suddenly feeling thick and suffocating. A younger woman might have felt a rush of adrenaline, a frantic need to know. Eleanor only felt profound, heavy sadness. She knew, with the intuition of a woman who had survived 1,000 political battles, that the content of this folder would change the color of her world forever. She sat in Julian's chair, the chair she had pushed him toward for 3 decades, and opened the folder. Inside was a series of memoranda, drafted by the young cabinet secretary she had grown to distrust. They were not just policy papers. They were a roadmap for a second term, a term that made no mention of the Vance Thorne coalition. The documents outlined a systematic dismantling of the very social programs Eleanor had spent her career building. They spoke of a new direction that prioritized corporate interests and short-term gains over the long-term stability she had championed. But the most devastating part of the discovery was a private letter, typed on the president's personal stationery and addressed to the party's primary donors. In it, Julian spoke of the need to shed the weight of the previous generation. He described himself as a man who had been held back by outdated loyalties and conservative caution. He explicitly detailed a plan to move Eleanor to an honorary, ceremonial role after the next election, a title with no power, a voice with no echo. He called it a graceful sunset for a dedicated servant. The words were cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of the history they shared. He was not talking about a political opponent. He was talking about the woman who had sacrificed her own ambitions to ensure his. He was talking about the partner who had held his hand through the deaths of parents and the failures of early campaigns. To Julian, she was no longer the North Star. She was a wait. Eleanor did not cry. At 70, she had seen enough of the world to know that tears were a luxury the powerful could rarely afford. Instead, she felt a strange, chilling clarity. She read the letter again, and then again, memorizing the phrases. She noted the dates. Some of these memos had been drafted months ago, during the very weeks he had looked her in the eye and thanked her for her unwavering support. The betrayal was total. It was not just a change in political strategy. It was a repudiation of their entire shared life. He was selling their legacy for a chance to stand alone, to be the sole master of his destiny. He was willing to burn the bridge they had built together, even while she was still standing on it. She sat there for a long time, watching the shadows grow longer across the floor. The clock on the mantel ticked with a rhythmic, indifferent precision. She thought about the early years, the small towns they had visited in the rain, the promises they had made to each other in the back of campaign buses. She realized then that Julian had never truly shared those dreams. He had simply used her belief in them to fuel his own ascent. She was the engine, and he was the driver, and now that the destination was in sight, he was ready to uncouple the car and leave it on the tracks. She replaced the folder exactly as she had found it. She smoothed the blotter, adjusted the paperweight, and stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and imbued with a new, terrifying purpose. She walked out of the study and through the long, darkened hallway of the residence. She passed the portraits of past presidents, men who had struggled with their own demons and their own betrayals. She felt a kinship with them now, a dark understanding of the isolation that comes with high office. When Julian returned late that night, smelling of expensive tobacco and the triumph of a successful fundraiser, she was waiting for him in the living room. She was reading a book, her face a mask of serene composure. "You're still up," he said, leaning over to kiss her cheek. His touch felt like ice against her skin. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice as smooth as glass. "I was just thinking about the future, Julian, about everything we've built." "It's a bright future, Eleanor," he said, turning toward the bar to pour himself a drink. "The brightest yet. You'll see." "I'm sure I will," she said softly. She watched him as he stood with his back to her, the leader of the free world, a man who believed he had successfully hidden his treachery behind a folder and a smile. He did not know that the original order was dead. He did not know that the woman who had made him was now the woman who knew exactly how to unmake him. The truth was confirmed, and with it, the quiet, patient work of the end had begun. There is a particular kind of suffering reserved for those who have spent their lives building monuments only to find themselves treated as the scaffolding, a temporary structure to be dismantled and discarded once the spire reaches the clouds. For Eleanor Vance, the humiliation was not a single, sharp blow. It was a slow, agonizing thinning of her presence. It was a realization that she had become a ghost in the very halls she had haunted with purpose for 3 decades. In the weeks following her discovery in the study, the world continued its frantic rotation, but Eleanor felt herself moving in a different, colder orbit. The humiliation was silent because it was built on a foundation of professional courtesy. It was found in the way the president's chief of staff would apologize for overlooking her on a memo distribution list, or the way Julian would gently talk over her in meetings, his voice a velvet curtain drawn across her intellect. She began to see the pity in the eyes of the young aides. They were the children of a faster, louder age, and to them, Eleanor was a relic of a quaint and dying diplomacy. They looked at her with the patronizing kindness one offers an elderly relative whose stories have been heard too many times. They did not see the woman who had negotiated ceasefires in the middle of the night, or the strategist who had saved Julian from a dozen scandals that would have ended a lesser man's career. They saw a wife who had overstayed her political welcome. The pain was not merely personal. It was an injury to her sense of honor. Eleanor had always believed that loyalty was a reciprocal currency. She had given Julian her youth, her sharpest years, and the potential of her own name. She had once been a rising star in her own right, a woman who could have occupied the very chair Julian now sat in. She had stepped aside because she believed their collective power was greater than the sum of its parts. She had traded her individual legacy for a shared one, believing that the bond between them was the highest form of integrity. Now, she stood in the East Room during receptions, her smile a masterpiece of disciplined endurance, watching Julian charm a room. She felt a profound sense of nakedness, as if the secret memos of Project Phoenix were written across her brow for all to see. To be dismissed by the world is one thing. To be dismissed by the person who knows the depth of your sacrifice is a humiliation that reaches into the marrow of the bone. She thought often of the things she had declined over the years. The invitations to lead major foundations, the opportunities to write her own memoirs, the simple, quiet life she might have had if she hadn't tethered her soul to the engine of Julian's ambition. She had no children, a choice they had made together to ensure there were no distractions from the work. Now, she realized that in his eyes, she was not a partner in that sacrifice. She was merely an instrument that had played its part and was now out of tune. One evening, they attended a small, private dinner for a retiring Supreme Court justice, an old friend who had seen them through every stage of their journey. During the toasts, the justice looked at Eleanor and spoke of her quiet strength and her unseen hand in the successes of the administration. It was meant as the highest compliment, a tribute to her role as the power behind the throne. But Julian's response was a revelation of his inner transformation. He stood up, his glass raised, and spoke of Eleanor as his loyal companion and a source of comfort at home. He framed her contribution not as intellectual or strategic, but as domestic and emotional. He effectively erased her from the history of his policy wins and the navigation of his crises. He reduced the architect of his presidency to a footnote of support. As he spoke, Eleanor felt the air in the room grow thin. She looked at the faces of their friends and saw them nodding, accepting this new narrative. It was the ultimate betrayal of their original order. He was rewriting the past in real time, stripping her of her professional dignity before an audience that had once feared her mind. She sat there, her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of 30 years of silence. She realized then that Julian did not just want her gone. He wanted her forgotten while she was still alive. He wanted to stand at the end of his term as a self-made titan, a man who had conquered the world through his own brilliance alone. Her presence was a reminder of his debts, and Julian Thorne was a man who had decided he no longer wished to pay them. The humiliation lived in the small spaces. The empty chair at the morning briefing, the ignored phone calls to the Legislative Affairs Office, the way the resident staff began to take their cues from Julian's personal secretary rather than her. It was a systematic stripping of her authority, a quiet exile within the walls of the White House. Late at night, Eleanor would sit in the darkness of her dressing room, listening to the muffled sounds of the city outside. She felt a deep, resonant ache for the life she had surrendered. She had played by the rules of honor and loyalty, and she was being punished for it. She saw now that Julian's morality was a flexible thing, a tool to be used when convenient and discarded when it became a burden. But in that silence, a new Eleanor began to form. The pain of the humiliation did not break her. It tempered her. It burned away the last remnants of her sentimentality and her hope for a reconciliation. She understood now that honor, when one-sided, is merely a vulnerability. If Julian wished to treat her as a ghost, she would become one, but not the kind that faded away. She would become the kind that haunted the halls, the kind that knew every secret door and every structural weakness of the house he thought he owned. The silent humiliation was the final lesson he would ever teach her. It taught her that the cost of her betrayal was everything she had ever given him. And as she watched the sun rise over the Washington Monument, casting a long, thin shadow like a needle across the mall, Eleanor Vance decided that if her life's work was to be stolen, she would ensure the thief found no joy in the prize. The pain had reached its limit, and the decision was beginning to take shape in the cold, clear light of dawn. There is a point in every tragedy where the protagonist must decide whether to remain a casualty of fate or to become its instrument. For Eleanor Vance, that moment did not come during a sleepless night or a fit of weeping. It came on a Tuesday afternoon during a routine signing ceremony in the Rose Garden. The air was crisp with the first hint of winter, and the sky was a hard, indifferent blue. As she stood 2 paces behind Julian, watching him use a pen she had gifted him to sign a bill she had spent 18 months negotiating, She felt profound, chilling stillness settle over her soul. Julian looked back at her for a split second, a practiced smile on his face for the benefit of the gathered press. It was the smile of a man who believed he had successfully navigated a difficult transition. He thought he had managed her. He thought that by slowly stripping away her influence, he was merely pruning a tree to let the trunk grow stronger. In his eyes, she saw not a partner, but a completed task. In that silence, Eleanor realized that leaving was not an option. To resign would be to validate his assessment of her, that she was a relic, a tired servant ready for the sunset. To stay and beg for her place would be a degradation she could not survive. And to leak his secrets to the press, to spark a common scandal of the flesh or the pocketbook, felt beneath the dignity of the life she had led. She did not want to destroy the office he held. She had too much respect for the institution for that. She wanted to destroy the man's hold on it. She decided then, with the cold precision of a grandmaster surveying a board, that if Julian Thorne believed he could exercise power without the foundation she provided, she would allow him to try. But she would not simply walk away. She would methodically, patiently, and invisibly withdraw the support structures she had spent 30 years placing beneath him. She would not explode in anger. She would not issue ultimatums. She would become the architect of his obsolescence. Her revenge would be characterized by the very things Julian had begun to lack: intelligence and patience. She knew the map of his soul better than he knew it himself. She knew his vanities, his intellectual shortcuts, and the specific people whose approval he craved. She knew that his current confidence was a house of cards, built on the assumption that the world worked the way she had always told him it worked. She would now stop telling him the truth. The decision felt like a heavy cloak being laid across her shoulders. It was a commitment to a long, lonely road. To carry out this plan, she would have to maintain the mask of the loyal, sideline spouse. She would have to endure the pity of the aides and the condescension of the new advisors for months, perhaps years. She would have to watch the man she had once loved, or the man she thought she had loved, slowly unravel, and she would have to be the one who quietly loosened the threads. This was not an act of spite. In her mind, it was an act of restoration. She believed in the original order, even if Julian did not. If the partnership was dead, then the power that grew from it was illegitimate. A man who betrayed his most fundamental covenant was not a man who could be trusted with the fate of a nation. By stripping him of his authority, she felt she was performing a final, painful service to the country. She thought of the morality of her choice. Was it a betrayal of her own? She weighed the cost of her silence against the cost of his unchecked ambition. Julian was moving toward a second term fueled by a new, more ruthless philosophy, one that discarded the honor and loyalty she held dear. If she did nothing, she was complicit in the birth of a monster she had helped create. If she acted, she was destroying the work of her own hands. The tragic irony was not lost on her. To save the legacy of the Eleanor Vance she used to be, she had become a woman she never thought she would be, a shadow, a saboteur, a silent judge. She would give him exactly what he wanted, the freedom to leave without her interference, and she would watch as that freedom became his noose. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Julian walked over to her. He took her hand, his touch light and impersonal. "A good day, Eleanor," he said, his eyes already scanning the room for the next person he needed to impress. The first step into a new era. "Yes, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, steady resonance. "A new era indeed." She looked at the hand holding hers, the hand that had signed the secret memos of Project Phoenix. She felt no anger, only a vast, empty clarity. The decision was made. The patient work of the end had begun. She would not leave. She would not scream. She would simply wait for the season to turn, knowing that she was the one who controlled the frost. As they walked back toward the Oval Office, Eleanor moved with a renewed grace. She was no longer a ghost. She was a gravity that Julian Thorne had forgotten he needed to stay grounded. And gravity, she knew, always wins in the end. The most effective way to dismantle a man who believes he is invincible is not to oppose him, but to grant him exactly what he desires. Eleanor Vance knew that Julian's greatest weakness was his newfound belief that he had outgrown her wisdom. For decades, She had been the invisible friction that prevented his momentum from turning into a fall. She had been the one to whisper the word of caution, to edit the inflammatory sentence out of his speech, and to quietly repair the bridges he burned in his moments of arrogance. To take her revenge, she simply had to stop being the friction. She began her campaign of strategic withdrawal with a terrifying patience. When the new advisors, led by the ambitious cabinet secretary, proposed a radical shift in trade policy that Eleanor knew would alienate the veteran senators of their own party, she did not fight it. In the past, she would have spent nights on the phone, cajoling and horse trading to ensure the bill was tempered. This time, she sat in the corner of the room, her hands folded, and when Julian looked to her for a reaction, she offered a small, encouraging nod. "I think the secretary has a modern perspective that we should explore, Julian," she said, her voice like silk. "Perhaps it is time for a bolder approach." Julian beamed, mistaking her compliance for submission. He felt a sense of relief, believing that Eleanor had finally accepted her place in the sunset of his career. He leaned into the radicalism of his younger staff, emboldened by the lack of resistance from the one person whose intellect he truly feared. He began to make public statements that were sharper, less considered, and increasingly divisive. He was building his own island, and Eleanor was the one who quietly made sure the tide was coming in. Her strategy was a masterpiece of omission. She began to filter the information that reached him, not by lying, but by prioritizing the voices he wanted to hear. She stepped back from the legislative liaisons, allowing the inexperienced staff to handle the delicate egos of the Capitol. She watched from a distance as minor disagreements with key allies were allowed to fester into open hostility. In the past, she would have hosted the private dinners that smoothed these ripples. Now, she claimed a sudden interest in her garden or a need for earlier nights, leaving Julian to navigate the social minefield alone. It was a slow, agonizing process. To the outside world, the administration seemed to be moving with a new, aggressive energy. But to those who knew the inner workings of the White House, the scent of instability was beginning to rise. Without Eleanor's grounding influence, Julian's speeches became more about him and less about the mission. He began to use the word "I" where he had once said "we." He became enamored with the image of himself as a lone wolf, a transformative figure who did not need the dusty traditions of the past. The cost of this was a gradual, systemic isolation. One by one, the old guard, the men and women who had been the backbone of Julian's support, began to feel the chill. They reached out to Eleanor, seeking the woman who had always been their advocate, only to find her strangely distant. Her conversation focused on the weather or the history of the portraits in the Blue Room. She gave them nothing but polite smiles and vague assurances. She was letting them realize on their own that the man they had supported no longer existed in the form they recognized. She watched as Julian's polling numbers began to soften in the areas that mattered most, the suburbs and the moderate heartland. His new advisors told him it was a temporary dip, a byproduct of his revolutionary spirit. Eleanor, looking at the same data, knew it was the beginning of a collapse. She saw the fissures in his cabinet, the quiet conversations between deputies who were starting to look for their next jobs. She saw the donors beginning to take meetings with his potential rivals, their confidence shaken by Julian's increasingly erratic legislative maneuvers. Through it all, Eleanor remained a perfect image of the supportive spouse. She was there for every photo op, standing by his side with a poise that felt more like a monument than a living person. She was a master of the long game. She knew that if she moved too quickly, he would suspect her hand in his decline. But if she allowed him to fail by his own hand, he would have no one to blame but the reflection in the mirror. She felt a strange, hollow sorrow as she watched him. It was a feeling a sculptor might have while watching their greatest work crumble due to a hidden flaw in the stone. There were moments, late at night, when he would come to her, looking tired and confused by the sudden resistance he was meeting from the world. In those moments, her old instincts would flare up. She would want to take his hand and tell him how to fix it, how to regain the ground he had lost. But then she would remember the folder. She would remember the words Project Phoenix and the clinical way he had planned to discard her. The pity would vanish, replaced by a cold, unwavering resolve. She was not destroying him. She was merely allowing him to be the man he had chosen to be without her protection. If that man was a failure, then 30 years of her life had been a lie. and she was prepared to face that truth. The long-term plan was not about a single moment of triumph. It was about the slow accumulation of consequences. It was about the way a man loses his power not through a coup, but through the quiet erosion of trust, the steady loss of respect, and the eventual realization that he is standing alone in a very large house. Eleanor Vance sat in her office, the light of the afternoon sun fading into gray, and she waited. She had set the clock in motion, and she was the only one who knew how much time was left before the midnight of Julian's presidency arrived. There is a particular silence that descends upon a seat of power when the world begins to sense that the center cannot hold. It is not the silence of peace, but the muffled quiet of a retreating army. As the winter deepened in Washington, coating the black iron fences of the White House in a fine, crystalline frost, Julian Thorne began to inhabit a landscape that was increasingly devoid of the voices he had once relied upon. He was the President of the United States, surrounded by a phalanx of Secret Service agents and a swarm of ambitious aides. Yet he was becoming the most isolated man in the Capitol. The isolation did not come as a sudden blow. It arrived as a series of misconnections and invitations that were politely declined. It was found in the way the senior leadership of his own party began to develop conflicting schedules whenever a White House strategy session was called. In the past, a summons from the president was an order that superseded all else. Now it was treated as a suggestion, one that could be weighed against other, more pressing priorities. Julian felt the change, though he could not quite name its source. He paced the Oval Office, his footsteps heavy on the great seal woven into the carpet, looking at his call logs with a growing sense of bewilderment. He blamed the shifting political climate. He blamed the obstructionism of the opposition. He blamed the media for failing to grasp the brilliance of his Project Phoenix vision. He looked everywhere for the cause of his sudden impotence, except at the woman who sat quietly in the solarium, her knitting needles clicking with a rhythmic, indifferent precision. Without Eleanor to act as the bridge, Julian found that he no longer spoke the language of the people who truly moved the levers of the city. He had spent years believing that his oratory was the primary source of his influence, forgetting that it was Eleanor's tireless, behind-the-scenes cultivation of relationships that gave his words their weight. When he spoke now, he was met with nods and polite applause, but the follow-through was absent. He was like a king whose decrees were being carried out by a ghost workforce that vanished the moment he left the room. His younger advisors, the ones who had promised him a new era of unencumbered power, were the first to show the cracks. They were masters of the optics, but they were amateurs in the art of the long-term alliance. When the first major policy initiative of the new guard, a sweeping deregulation of the energy sector, stalled in the Senate committee, these advisors did not know how to fix it. They looked to Julian for leadership, and Julian, accustomed to having Eleanor provide the roadmap, looked back at them with a hollow, mounting panic. The betrayal he had planned for her was now being mirrored in the way the world treated him. He was being managed by his own staff, given sanitized briefings that had the true extent of the legislative collapse. He was being treated as a figurehead, a man whose primary utility was his ability to look presidential on a television screen, while the actual substance of his administration eroded like sand in a high tide. One evening, Julian returned to the residence later than usual. He found Eleanor in the library, the room lit only by the soft glow of a single lamp. He looked smaller than he had only a year before. The weight of his isolation was visible in the sag of his shoulders and the way he reached for a decanter of scotch with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "They aren't listening, Eleanor," he said, his voice raw with a frustration that bordered on despair. "The speaker, the majority leader, they listen to me. They smile, and then they go back to the Hill and do exactly as they please. It's as if I'm not even in the room." Eleanor looked up from her book, her expression one of mild, detached concern. She did not offer a solution. She did not tell him which levers to pull or which secrets to use as leverage. She did not remind him that she had spent decades ensuring those men felt heard so that they would, in turn, hear him. "Politics is a fickle business, Julian," she said softly. "Perhaps they simply have different priorities now. Values change. Loyalties shift. It is the way of things." He looked at her, searching for the partner who would stay up until 3 a.m. to help him draft a counterproposal. But that woman was gone. In her place was a dignified, distant observer who seemed to view his downfall as a natural phenomenon, like the changing of the seasons. "I need you to talk to them," he said, his tone shifting from frustration to a kind of desperate command. "You have a way with the speaker. He trusts you." Eleanor paused, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm afraid I've stepped back from those matters, Julian. You were quite clear that you wanted a fresh approach, untethered from the past. It wouldn't be right for me to interfere with the new direction you've chosen. It might undermine your authority." The words were a mirror of his own justifications to her months earlier, and they hit him with the force of a physical blow. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand, but the look in her eyes, a look of serene, untroubled clarity, stopped him. He realized then that he could not compel the very thing he had discarded. He had traded her loyalty for a freedom he now found he was ill-equipped to handle. As the weeks passed, Julian's isolation became a tangible thing. He would sit at the long table in the cabinet room, surrounded by people who were already looking past him toward the next election cycle. He was a traitor who betrayed the very foundation of his success, and now he was suffering the ultimate consequence. He was being allowed to fail in total, absolute solitude. He began to spend more time in the residence, avoiding the West Wing where the air felt thick with his own obsolescence. He would wander the halls, looking at the portraits of his predecessors, wondering which of them had also felt the cold touch of a world that had moved on without them. He was still the president, but the power had drained out of him, leaving behind only the husk of an office. And through it all, Eleanor remained. She was the one constant in his dissolving world, the only person who did not look at him with pity or calculated ambition. But her presence was the cruelest isolation of all. She was there, but she was no longer with him. She was a witness to his decline, the silent judge who watched as he reaped the harvest of the wind he had sown. He was alone in his house, alone in his office, and most tragically, alone in the presence of the only woman who could have saved him, if only he hadn't decided that she was a weight to be shed. The grandeur of high office often masks the fact that life is lived in the small spaces, in the seconds between the heavy doors closing and the next meeting beginning. For Eleanor, the reality of her transformation and Julian's slow unraveling was most visible not in the polls or the headlines, but in the ordinary details of their shared domesticity. The White House is a house of many rooms. Yet as their bond frayed, it felt as though the space between them was expanding even as the walls closed in. There was the matter of the morning tea. For 30 years, Eleanor had known exactly how Julian preferred it. A specific blend of Earl Grey, steeped for exactly 4 minutes, with a single sliver of lemon. It was a small ritual, a gesture of care that signaled the start of their joint endeavor. Now, she simply left the task to the kitchen staff. She watched from across the breakfast table as a steward placed a cup before the president. Julian took a sip, frowned at the unfamiliar strength of the brew, and looked toward Eleanor. She did not meet his eyes. She was busy smoothing a wrinkle in the linen tablecloth, her focus entirely on the symmetry of the fabric. Silence became the most prominent resident of their private quarters. It was not the companionable quiet of a long-wedded couple, but a dense, heavy thing that sat between them at dinner, like an uninvited guest. The clink of a silver fork against a porcelain plate became a startling intrusion. Julian would try to bridge the gap with talk of the day's trivialities, the weather, a minor diplomatic arrival, the state of the garden, but his voice sounded hollow in the vastness of the dining room. Eleanor would respond with polite, one-word affirmations, her grace as impenetrable as armor. She noticed the small signs of his aging that she had previously worked so hard to hide. In the past, she would have quietly told him to straighten his tie, or she would have used a lint roller on his jacket before he stepped out. She would have reminded him to take his blood pressure medication. Now, she observed the stray threads on his sleeve and the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a glass of water with the clinical detachment of a historian. She saw the way his skin had turned the color of parchment under the harsh fluorescent lights of the study, a detail she would once have found heartbreaking. One rainy Tuesday, they found themselves alone in the residence elevator, a small wood-paneled box that felt like confessional. For 30 seconds, they were trapped in a space no larger than a closet. Julian reached out, his hand hovering near her elbow, a ghost of the gesture he used to make when he sought her strength. He seemed on the verge of saying something, perhaps an apology, perhaps a plea. But Eleanor chose that moment to adjust the collar of her coat, turning slightly away to check her reflection in the polished brass of the elevator door. "The light in here is becoming quite dim," she remarked to the air. "I must remind the usher to have the bulbs replaced." The elevator doors opened, and the moment passed, unseized and unmourned. The most telling detail was the empty room at the end of the hall. It had been intended as a shared library, a place where they would eventually archive their joint papers and plan their post-presidency life. Now, the door remained closed. Eleanor had stopped entering it weeks ago, when a maid mentioned that dust was beginning to settle on the leather-bound volumes of their early campaign speeches. Eleanor simply nodded and suggested the room be kept locked to preserve the condition of the materials. It was a tomb for a future that no longer existed. Even their shared meals began to feel like a performance for an audience that wasn't there. Julian would sit at the head of the table, the portrait of a leader, but he struggled with the simplest of tasks. He would fumble with the salt cellar or lose his train of thought in the middle of a sentence about a budget subcommittee. Eleanor would wait through his pauses, her expression one of patient, distant courtesy. She did not finish his sentences anymore. She did not offer the word he was searching for. She allowed the silence to stretch until it became a physical weight, forcing him to confront the vacuum where her support used to be. Late at night, Eleanor would sit in her dressing room, listening to the sound of Julian pacing in the bedroom next door. The floorboards would creak, a small, ordinary sound that echoed through the residence. In years past, she would have gone to him, offered a glass of warm milk or a listening ear. Now, she simply turned off her lamp and sat in the dark, watching the shadows of the trees outside dance against the wall. These were the ordinary details of a life being dismantled. No shouting, no broken glass, no dramatic exits. Just the steady withdrawal of 1,000 small kindnesses, the quiet removal of the mortar that holds a life together. Julian was learning that a man can be surrounded by the greatest luxuries in the world and still starve for the lack of a single, sincere glance. He was discovering that the cost of betrayal is not paid in gold or power, but in the loss of the small, everyday things that make a person feel seen. Eleanor Vance was the only person who truly saw him, and she had decided to look away. In the quiet of the final months, the air in the White House grew thin, as if the oxygen of purpose had been sucked from the rooms. Eleanor Vance moved through this rarefied atmosphere with the stillness of a statue, a woman who had come to understand that the greatest tragedies are not those that end in fire, but those that end in a cold, immutable silence. She did not judge Julian. She did not need to. She simply stood back and allowed the architecture of his choices to provide its own verdict. The moral calculus of power is often misunderstood by those who seek it. They believe that power is a shield, a fortress that can protect one from the consequences of a broken vow. But as Eleanor observed Julian from across the vast, empty distances of their shared life, she saw that power does not protect honor. It only makes its absence more visible. A man can hold the world in his hands, but if his word is hollow, he is merely holding a handful of dust. Betrayal, she realized, always carries a price, but the currency is not always what one expects. Julian had expected a political cost, perhaps a dip in the polls or a difficult primary challenge. He was prepared for those battles. He was not prepared for the bankruptcy of his own spirit. By discarding the woman who held his conscience, he had discarded the conscience itself. He had become a man who could win any argument, but could no longer remember why the argument mattered. She watched him during a late-night televised address. The cameras caught the way he leaned into the podium, his voice still resonant, his hair perfectly silver under the studio lights. To the millions watching at home, he looked like the embodiment of American leadership. But Eleanor, sitting in the shadows of the residence, saw the hollowness in the eyes. She saw the way he looked for a validation that was no longer there. He was a performer playing to an empty house, and the applause of the masses could not fill the silence of the woman in the wings. The theme of their lives had once been loyalty. It was the bedrock of the original order. They had believed that as long as they were true to each other, they could be true to the country. But when Julian chose to see loyalty as a burden rather than a bond, he severed the cord that kept him anchored to his own humanity. He had traded a lifetime of shared honor for a few years of solitary ego, and the trade was proving to be a ruinous one. Eleanor did not feel a sense of triumph. There is no joy in watching a grand cathedral collapse, even if you're the one who removed the keystones. She felt only a profound, heavy clarity. She had lived her life by a code of service, and she realized now that her final service to Julian, and perhaps to the office he held, was to let him see the full weight of his betrayal. To forgive him would have been to lie to him. It would have been to tell him that his actions had no consequence. And Eleanor Vance was done with lies. She thought about the younger generation that now occupied the West Wing, the ones who had whispered in Julian's ear about modernization and shedding the past. They were not villains. They were merely people who did not understand the cost of a foundation. They believed that power was something to be seized and spent, like a windfall. They did not know that power is something that must be tended, like a flame, and that the fuel for that flame is the integrity of the person who holds the match. The morality of her own revenge weighed on her, but it did not break her. She had chosen a path of patience and silence, a path that allowed Julian to be the author of his own downfall. She had not lied. She had not cheated. And she had not broken any laws. She had simply stopped being the mercy that mitigated his arrogance. If that was a sin, she was prepared to answer for it. But in the cold light of the Potomac morning, she felt it was less a sin and more a somber, necessary accounting. As the sun began to set on the final year of the term, the administration was a ghost of its former self. The ambitious bills had failed, the scandals of new advisors had eroded the public trust, and the president was a man who spoke to no one and was heard by fewer. The tragedy was not that he had lost his power. The tragedy was that he had lost a man he was supposed to be when he gained it. Honor is a quiet thing. Eleanor thought as she closed her briefing book for the final time. It does not shout from the rooftops or demand a spotlight. It is found in the kept promise, the shared burden, and the steady hand in the dark. Once it is gone, no amount of prestige or authority can bring it back. Julian Thorne had learned too late that while you can build a throne out of anything, you can only build a legacy out of the truth. And the truth was the one thing he had decided he could live without. The end of a presidency is often described as a whirlwind of activity, a frantic rush to sign the final pardons and clear the desks of the next inhabitant. But for Eleanor Vance, the final days were characterized by a stillness, so profound it felt as though the world itself had stopped breathing. The boxes were packed, the files were archived, and the heavy drapes of the residence were drawn against the biting January wind. The transition was underway, not just for the country, but for the woman who had spent 30 years as the silent architect of another man's life. Julian sat in the center of the Oval Office, the room stripped of the personal touches that had once made it his. The mahogany desk was bare. He looked like a man who had finally woken from a long, feverish dream only to find that the house he lived in was on fire. The polls had finished their descent. The party had already moved on to a younger, fresher face, and his legacy was a collection of half measures and missed opportunities. He was 72 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was truly, fundamentally alone. He found Eleanor in the solarium, watching the snow fall over the north lawn. She was dressed for travel, her coat buttoned to the chin, her face a mask of serene, unreadable calm. There was no anger left in the room, only the cold, lingering scent of things that had been allowed to die. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "I didn't see it. I didn't see any of it until the end." She did not turn to look at him. She watched a single snowflake drift against the glass and disappear. "You saw what you wanted to see, Julian. You saw a future where you didn't have to be reminded of the cost of your climb. You wanted to be the light without the shadow. I thought I could do it," he whispered, moving toward her but stopping a few feet away, as if an invisible wall now separated them. "I thought I was enough." Eleanor finally turned her gaze to him. Her eyes were not unkind, but they were empty of the devotion that had once been his greatest asset. "No one is ever enough, Julian. That was the secret of the order. We were the strength because we were the truth for each other. When you decided that the truth was a burden, you became a man without a foundation. You are not a failure because of your enemies. You are a failure because you betrayed the only person who knew how to keep you whole." Julian looked at her, and in that moment, the realization finally took hold. He saw the decades of her silence, the thousands of small fires she had put out, and the patient, clinical way she had withdrawn her hand when he sought to cast her aside. He saw that his downfall was not a conspiracy of his rivals, but the natural consequence of his own vanity. He had reached for the sun and found only the cold, and the woman who could have brought him back was already halfway out the door. "I'm sorry," he said, the word sounding small and hollow in the vastness of the White House. Eleanor offered him a small, sad smile, the kind one gives to a stranger who has lost their way. "I know you are, Julian, but sorrow is a private thing. It doesn't change the architecture of the past." She picked up her bag and walked toward the door. She did not look back at the man standing in the center of the room, the man she had made, the man she had unmade. She walked through the long, echoing corridors for the last time, her heels clicking against the marble in a steady, rhythmic pulse. She passed the portraits of the men who had come before, their painted eyes watching her departure with a silent, historical indifference. When she stepped out into the cold January air, the silence of the city felt like a benediction. She did not feel a sense of victory. There was no triumph in the wreckage of a 30-year covenant. She felt only a vast, hollow emptiness, the kind that comes when a long and difficult task is finally finished. She had defended her honor, she had exacted her price, and she was leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back and the integrity of her silence. Julian remained in the window, watching her car pull away. He would live for many more years, a ghost of a former power, a man who would spend his days writing memoirs that no one would truly believe. He would haunt the libraries and the speaking circuits, forever searching for the reflection of the man he used to be, and forever failing to find it because the mirror had walked away. The story of the Van Storm administration will be written by historians as a period of transition, a time of missed potential and quiet decline. They would speak of the president's sudden loss of influence and the mysterious withdrawal of his most trusted advisor. They would look for the scandals and the secret enemies, never realizing that the true tragedy was much simpler and much more common. It was a story of vow broken and a debt unpaid. As the gates of the White House closed behind her, Eleanor Vance looked out at the monuments of Washington, cold and white against the gray sky. She had played the game to its final move, and the board was now empty. The original order was gone, replaced by a lingering, unsettling quiet that would follow Julian Thorne to his grave. It is a difficult thing to weigh the value of a life spent in the service of another, only to find the foundation was made of sand. If it were you, would you choose the path of forgiveness, or would you, like Eleanor, choose to leave in silence, letting the consequences speak for themselves? Thank you for reflecting on this journey with me. If this story moved you, perhaps you might consider subscribing to the channel to join us for more tales of history and the human heart. Your thoughts are always welcome in the comments below. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.